Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I'm Valora Washington, CEO of the CAYL Institute. And as always, we're delighted that you joined us for this conversation that we're going to be having with you today. It is always such a pleasure that so many of you keep coming back to learn about exciting things happening in the field of early childhood education. And it's our goal at CAYL to bring you timely, relevant, and immediately actionable topics of interest about young children and the people who work with them. And at the end of the webinar, you will be receiving an email follow-up, which will have many of the resources that we are referring to today. So we are the community advocates for young learners, and we have values that we really work to represent, including our commitment to diversity, our focus on solutions, our focus on having an impact, on being innovative, and on building and sharing knowledge. And it is definitely through this webinar series that we build and share knowledge with you, because you are the architects of change that our field really, really needs. This year in 2022, we have really had a theme of imagine, innovate, and have an impact. And in the first few months of the year, we really focused a lot on the first of these, which was imagination. And we talked about Albert Einstein, who said imagination is more important than knowledge. He said that knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulates progress, and gives birth to evolution. And so in the past months, we've imagined, what would it be like for 21st century kindergarten? What would universal childcare and early education really look like? How do we respect the early educator? And we really imagined how we in the United States might catch up with some other global strategies that are supporting children and families. And as we've talked about imagination in the first part of the year, now we're turning our attention to the second part of our theme, which is innovation. So we realize that childhood has changed, and therefore, those of us who are teaching and raising young children must change too. And change means we need to be innovative. We may need to think differently. And we once again turn to Albert Einstein, who tells us, as we're thinking about being innovative, that we cannot solve our problems with the same level of thinking we used when we created them. So, the next few months, we're going to think about being innovative as early childhood educators. And as we support this new generation of alpha children, this diverse generation, this tech savvy generation, how are we going to approach them in ways that really meet their needs? That's what we're going to be talking about over the next few months. Today, we're bringing you a really exciting topic, and that is the idea of play and how we can really make space for play. And in our agenda today, we're going to have several people speaking with you today. Dr. Sarah Lytle, Christine Kroger, and we're going to have Zviko Kanyoka. What is a little bit different about what we're talking about when we're going to be talking about play today is we're going to be talking about play in community spaces. Most of us are used to talking about play in our programs, in our centers, in our family childcare homes. But what about in our communities? Are our communities really maximizing our public spaces as play spaces for children? And how could we innovate our public spaces so we're making more room for play? These are the questions that we're going to be talking about today. How our communities can be innovative and innovative ways they can make space for play. And so we have these really exciting leaders who are going to share with us, and they're leaders who are connected through the Playful Learning Landscapes Action Network. Sarah Lytle is the executive director, and she's joined with two of their partners, Christine Kroger and Zviko Kanyoka. And so we're going to have a chance today to think about community spaces for play by thinking about some projects led in rural Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, as well as the co-design process that Play Africa is using with children in Johannesburg and beyond. So making space for play is a global movement, a community-based movement that we're going to talk about today. And as we get started, we want to remind you, as always, that we are recording this video so that people who are working with children right now can listen to it when it's convenient for them. Closed captioning is available and accessible to you. And we encourage you to write your questions and comments in the chat. We really want to hear from you. And remember, this webinar is only an hour. It only whets your appetite about this important topic of making room for play. So be sure to read the follow-up email for the resources if you want to dig deeper, or if you want to contact our speakers after this webinar, we'll have their contact information available to you there as well. Everything that we're doing is all based on this idea that as early childhood professionals, we can overcome the challenges that we face, that this is a pivotal moment in our field, and that we can be leaders, we can be the architects of change that really make a difference for the children and the families and the staff who are working with young children. And we've written a book about that based on our experience leading leaders in the field that we hope that you will find of interest. So let's turn now to our topic of the day. How do we make space for play? So there's a couple of ideas I want you to keep in mind as you're listening to our three innovators today. One, we really are focusing on community spaces. And I think that brings a very unique perspective. And as we focus on community spaces, listen to our experts, and you're going to hear how they are really bringing children's voices and opinions into creating these spaces, and how these spaces are being developed throughout the world with public-private collaboration. So as we think about making space for play, we want you to imagine your own community and imagine the public spaces in your community and how we can turn these spaces into learning opportunities for our children, because we need to leverage all of the time that children are spending outside of the classroom. And this is true now more than ever in this COVID era. And in everything we do, we take a very strong science-based approach. So how do we infuse the science of learning into these specific community play spaces? These are the ideas I want you to be listening for today and to ask questions about as we move forward with this topic. So now it is a great pleasure for me to introduce you to our panel of Dr. Sarah Lytle and Zviko Kanyoka and Christine Kroger. Let's learn how they're doing it and see how we might apply what they're teaching us to the communities in which we live. So let's turn it to you, Sarah. Welcome. We're so happy to have you here with the CAYL Institute today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Laura. And I must say that I am honored to be here as the kickoff of this innovation thread of webinars that you all are hosting. And I do think that playful learning in public spaces, as we think about it with Playful Learning Landscapes Action Network, really is an innovation. And I think that we have a lot of evidence and are continuing to gather evidence about the effectiveness of this approach. So you heard a wonderful setup from Valora. I'd like to dig a little bit deeper here before we get into our other two panelists who are going to share some really great examples from the communities in which they work. But I want to think a little bit about sort of the theoretical motivation for this and how we think about it, how we design, and then give us some examples of what it is we mean when we talk about playful learning landscapes. So as Laura said, we focus really on learning in communities. And we do that because we know that children only spend about 20% of their waking hours in formal learning environments like school, childcare, or early learning centers. A full 80% of their waking hours are spent in the community with their families and in informal learning environments like libraries, for example. When we couple that with everything that we know from research and science about the importance of children's earliest years and the importance of that for brain development, for those foundational skills that are going to prepare children for the future, we have to consider the kinds of opportunities that we're giving children within their communities. So looking to those public spaces. The truth is that towns and cities were never designed with children and families in mind. They were designed with function in mind. But what if that weren't the case? What if we could increase educational equity by providing playful learning opportunities for children and families in the very places and spaces where they live? So enter playful learning landscapes. As Valora said, this is a global movement truly to transform everyday spaces like bus stops, corner lots, grocery stores, laundromats into those high quality playful learning opportunities for children and families. So when we talk about playful learning, we are simply describing playful activities that are guided by the adult or the environment toward a specific learning goal. That is, an adult can set the stage, but once children are there, it's a choose your own adventure moment for them. They're in charge. And playful learning is really based on decades of research that tells us both how children learn and what children need to learn to flourish in the 21st century. When we think about the conditions under which children learn best, so that how children learn, we have 5 principles, all of which are, again, derived from research and based on the science of learning, that tell us that children learn best when activities and environments are actively engaging, when they're meaningful to them, when they're socially interactive, when they're iterative, so you can have a different experience every time you interact in that environment, and when the environment or activity is joyful. And as much as we talk about this as the principles of how children learn, it is in fact the principles of how humans learn. This is how the human brain learns. And so we lean into that with playful learning landscapes by designing with these principles in mind. We combine all of these when we're thinking about designing a new playful learning space or activity for children and families. When we think about what children need to learn to flourish in the 21st century, again, based on research, we have 6 skills that we have pulled out from those decades and what business leaders have told us, the skills that they're looking for in the folks that they hire, and the skills that we know are going to prepare children for a world in which the jobs that they will eventually have don't currently exist. And so those 6 C's, as we call them, are collaboration. So how do children interact with other people in the world? Communication. How well can you articulate your thoughts, your feelings, your ideas? Content, which is perhaps more of a traditionally associated learning goal. So this is a skill we tend to associate most closely with learning and school-based learning. Things like literacy, math skills, science skills, all of that gets wrapped up in content. And that's certainly important, but keep in mind that it's only one of our 6 C's. The next C is critical thinking. How well can you summarize evidence and draw a conclusion or transfer knowledge between different contexts? The early learning field has focused a lot lately on executive functioning in particular, and this is very related and certainly a skill for the future. The 5th C is creative innovation. So are you able to come up with new ideas and new solutions to problems? And then finally, we have confidence. You can have the best ideas in the world, but how do you share them? Do you own your opinions and stick up for them? Do you recover after something doesn't work as you thought it might? So these 6 C's together then form the learning goals for our activities installations that we design for playful learning landscapes. Now, let's think about what this looks like in person. We like to ask ourselves and really focus our design process on a kind of question. So we oftentimes think about, when is a bench not a bench? In other words, how can you take something that is so ubiquitous in cities and communities and transform it into a playful learning space for children and families? And so when we design for playful learning, we use a formula that combines everything that I mentioned about how children learn, those actively engaging, meaningful, socially interactive, iterative, and joyful qualities, along with at least one of those 6 C's as our learning goal that we're going to embed in that activity or installation. And then we customize the design based on a specific community's culture and values. If you recall, one of the conditions under which humans learn is meaningful. The activity, the environment should be meaningful. So by incorporating the community's values and culture into these designs, we ensure that all of the designs are meaningful and relevant for the community. The community becomes invested with them because they've told us what they want and they help us build it. They're really part of the process from start to finish. So here are some examples. If you think about a bus stop, when is a bus stop not a bus stop? Well, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, we transformed a bus stop. And in fact, this is my background photo here. This is a bus stop that's adjacent to a corner lot. It was formerly an empty corner lot. And the bus stop was transformed with puzzle walls. So cylinders on rods that can spin, you can twist them around and around and create puzzles with them. On one puzzle, we had the name of the neighborhood. Again, that's very meaningful and relevant to the community, works on some of those literacy skills for children, one of those 6 C's. And we also, on another puzzle wall, had a picture of Martin Luther King Jr., which was, again, a very meaningful and relevant image for the community, as this particular location was where Martin Luther King Jr. kicked off one of his speaking tours. In Santa Ana, California, we are in the process of transforming some bus stops into loteria games. So the Santa Ana community is a Mexican-American population predominantly, and they have told us that loteria is it's a bingo type game that they are largely familiar with. And the parents and caregivers really wanted to pass that down to their children and show them how to play that. So we are building bus stops in collaboration with the city of Santa Ana that incorporate a loteria game on the back wall of those bus shelters. Giving folks an opportunity to engage and have that conversation while they're waiting for a bus. If you think of a library as a public space, for example, what does that look like if a library is not a library? Again, as we think about cities not being designed for children and families, libraries are pretty good examples of that. Even though children's librarians are amazing and have wonderful resources for families, traditional libraries are places where you are quiet and you don't talk very loud and you certainly don't run around. But what if we transform a space in libraries to have reading nooks where kids can manipulate their bodies and be comfortable while they look at books? What if we have a climbing wall that incorporates letters of the alphabet so you can spell a word as you climb up a wall? What if we have tangram blocks that you can manipulate and do some big body play in a library that allows you to see how different shapes fit together? We've done that in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, with great results. What about a basketball court? Basketball is inherently a fun game for kids, and that's wonderful. But what if we worked in a little bit of a learning goal there? We've designed a game called Fraction Ball, where we take the 3-point line, transform it to a 1-point line, and then have a couple of smaller arcs that are closer to the basket. We have an arc that's a 1/4 point arc. We have an arc that's a 1/2 point arc, and an arc that's a 3/4 point arc. And the idea is you have to add fractions in order to, get your score for the game and get to the highest number. We've also transformed that basketball court so that half of the court has fractions and half of it has decimals. So kids are learning how to convert fractions to decimals. And finally, what about a grocery store? What if we included prompts for children and families to measure the weight of their produce with the scales that are in most grocery stores? What if we had prompts or signage that allowed families to talk about their generationally passed down methods of finding ripe fruit? These are things that we've done. And again, we know that they spark conversations. Evaluations of these and other playful learning spaces consistently find large increases in caregiver-child interactions, as much as 50% increases, which is a really large effect. So this tells us that we're not only creating spaces where children and families feel welcome and feel like they belong, but we're also integrating these high-quality playful learning opportunities for children in these everyday spaces. We're literally meeting families where they are, and we're giving kids the skills and those opportunities that we know are going to set them up for success. So with that, I'd like to turn it over now to my colleague, Zviko Kanyoka of Play Africa. And I'm so excited for her to share some of the wonderful work that she and her organization are doing. So Zviko, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I am Zviko Kanyoka, and I am the head of placemaking programs at Play Africa in Johannesburg. Play Africa is Southern Africa's pioneering children's museum, creating shared, inclusive, and equitable spaces for children's play and learning. But most of the work we do is in communities themselves. We transform existing public spaces for playful learning, bridging divides, inspiring parents and teachers, and building social cohesion in our divided society. We're also an African education makerspace, a research and development engine of scalable innovations, specifically designed for low resource settings across Africa. By operating extensively outside museum walls, we're imagining what a museum can be and what it can achieve. we reach children where they are and offer free access in partnership with more than 245 schools and NGOs in marginalized communities. Our approach to community partnerships makes us one of the most inclusive museums in the world. Speaking more specifically to our context in which we work in, according to UNICEF, only 29% of children in South Africa have access to safe play areas. This alone places a great demand for the programs we offer. Every child has the right to participate in public life, and in our placemaking programs, we help children be seen, heard, and valued with voices and ideas that matter. By nature of the context in which we work, we're ideally positioned to develop new solutions that are both locally relevant and globally pioneering. South Africa's independence is very young, and like many other African countries, we're still very much in the healing phase of the post-colonial condition. Africa is the youngest continent, and we're currently faced with rapid urbanization that is crowding cities that were never built for this population boom. By 2050, Africa will be home to 40% of the world's children under the age of 5, and its urban population will triple, with another 950 million people crowding into limited infrastructure. Africa needs to be on the radar of everyone who cares about children. In South Africa specifically, children will live in cities with legacies of exclusion, infrastructure designed intentionally under colonialism and apartheid to perpetuate spatial inequalities. As a result, we're continually asking ourselves how we as Play Africa can make significant contributions to make our cities more inclusive, safe, and sustainable, especially for children. In some of our early programs, we have created books such as The Big Show, developed in partnership with Johannesburg City Parks and Zoo and the UN Environmental Program to get children excited about experiencing parks and public spaces around them. It also includes playful activities for children to observe nature and to build awareness about climate change. This program quickly showed us how many South African children have been taught to fear park environments. In efforts to understand these perceptions better, we have invited children to build models to describe their perceptions and hopes for spaces within their communities. On one occasion where we were running a program to reconnect children to their public spaces, we had one little girl aged 8 who entered a park for the very first time in her life, even though this park was situated directly across the street from her school. Experiences such as this push us to creatively come up with innovations that ensure children's right to the city is upheld. One of the major ways we're now achieving this is by embracing design thinking to empower children to participate in urban placemaking. Through hands-on workshops, we're centering children's experiences, feelings, and needs. We're helping children learn how to ideate, prototype, and test possible solutions for safer, more playful communities. This ensures that children's voices are heard and that they feel their existence and views of the world around them matter. Our co-design process is centered on our image of the child. We see every child as curious, strong, and full of potential, as complete citizens with the capacity to solve problems and identify new solutions in placemaking. Through Play Africa's co-design process, we help communities create spaces that are designed to support how children learn, creating spaces that ignite play and playful learning that is actively engaging, meaningful, socially interactive, iterative, and joyful. We see every child in Africa as a change maker. By inviting children to actively participate in designing better cities and communities, we're creating opportunities for them to develop the critical skills and hands-on experiences they will need to thrive in the future. We have tested this co-design approach with hundreds of children in low-resource settings across South Africa, and we want every child to have this experience. And as a result, we have created a free toolkit so anyone can adapt and use our design thinking workshops to focus on children's needs. In testing this toolkit in a range of African settings, we've been proving that involving children in designing more playful communities is both possible and powerful. Some of the settings in which we have tested this methodology include informal settlements, townships, and township schools. We have achieved this in partnership with a diverse range of community leaders, of local community organizations, graduate architects, and educators. In our engagement with children making use of this approach, it has been really powerful to see children advocate for themselves and speak on the various unseen context and age-specific experiences and challenges they face in their daily spaces. Not only have they been identifying and sharing challenges, but they have also been playing with their creativity to ideate and prototype solutions for these challenges they face as well. Some of the information we're gathering from these workshops also reveal some harrowing threats that children face in their environments. On one occasion, we had a child design a device with a panic button that they could use to send an alert if they had an encounter with an adult touching them inappropriately while they're using a public space. Some of the challenges children share highlight both major and subtle ways in which they are being designed out of the city. These include a lack of pedestrian-friendly avenues and street lights. Some have noted noise pollution, busy and unsafe roads, unregulated transport services. We're also even seeing an increased awareness with children regarding the unequal access they have to play spaces across genders. Speaking more specifically to play, through the workshop, we're also learning about rituals and forms of play that children have in their very specific communities and contexts that often go missed by adults that use the very same spaces with them. What we're proving through this program is that playful learning environments are valuable, and children absolutely have the capacity to participate in the development of those. We're excited to have been rolling out a 3-year project to roll out our Designing with Children approach across sub-Saharan Africa. This will ensure that thousands more children are empowered with playful learning landscapes that can help nurture their fullest potential. To help us reach these numbers, we are also training urban professionals, educators, community leaders, parents and guardians, and unemployed young people on how to use Play Africa's methodology for partner-led workshops as well. Thank you very much. I will now hand over to Christine Kroger.
Hi, I'm Christine. Thank you. Neighborhood North is a relatively new children's museum in a small Rust Belt community in rural Pennsylvania. So our organization is much newer than the others, but it's such a pleasure to be here and be part of this conversation. Our organization was formed to address the inequities in our region's educational ecosystem, most significantly felt by our large African-American community and our families experiencing poverty. And so for this discussion, I'm mostly focusing on the equity issue and the justice issue for play. During COVID, we used our museum space to run learning pods, partnering with our local school district to support the online learning of about 100 elementary school students, the majority of whom were African-American. We had known about the educational disparities and learning challenges prior to COVID, but being intimately involved in both the learners and the families' lives during that year allowed us to understand our community's needs at a more fundamental level. That experience helped to inform our focus really on parent-child engagement and really supporting that relationship and removing barriers to meet families where they are. Our work seeks to strengthen the holistic and supportive ecosystem for families of young children through more intentional collaborations within the community and by providing opportunities for fun and meaningful experiences that connect our families and support caregivers in their role as their child's first and lifelong teacher. And we firmly believe that our surroundings say a lot about what we value and how we feel about ourselves and our communities. When there's been significant disinvestment in a place, or when the dominant narrative does not make space for other voices, we begin to internalize feelings of disinterest and insignificance, and so do our children. And these feelings will often become behaviors that look like disrespect and destruction, and we've all seen that in our kids when that happens. However, the alternative is also true. When investment of beauty, art, and culture is made into a space, and when marginalized voices are elevated, we become curious and playful and begin to imagine what's possible. At Neighborhood North, at our museum, one of our favorite exhibits is an outdoor exhibit. We have 5 large, brightly colored metal flower sculptures in the garden outside of our museum. And our museum sits at the corner of 2 main streets in our town, one on the same street as our local school. And so every day we get to see kids walking back and forth from school. And each flower is a musical instrument that plays a different tone when hit with a mallet. And when we first had these flowers installed, we were curious to watch as children and families responded to them. And we were surprised to see that many of the local children in our community, many of the local children and families, especially those experiencing poverty, did not interact with them at first, or not until they were invited to do so. And inversely, many children from more affluent homes ran right up to the instruments and played with them without reservation. And furthermore, they were encouraged to do so by their caregivers and were often asked questions about the music they were making or the colors of the flowers or about the different tones. Lots of scaffolded learning going on. And that was exactly what we had hoped would happen when they installed that exhibit. And this type of exhibit was common in many parks and museums across America. But what we discovered was that many kids in our local community had not had exposure to this kind of installation. And so they didn't take notice of it, or they didn't think it was for them. So after we spent some time talking with our local families and children about this exhibit, now they're excited and feel comfortable playing and making music with the flower sculptures. But what we noted was that the kids from more affluent homes had been conditioned to see the flowers and to see play in their built environment, and that our neighborhood kids had not grown up in an environment that equipped them to see the flowers. And so the installation didn't spark curiosity or playfulness in them until more information was given. And so there are a number of studies that speak to this, but I find the data story published by Wilkening Consulting titled Curiosity, Empathy, and Social Justice to be really helpful. Their research noted that when public health practitioners evaluate when children are flourishing, they assess 3 things: curiosity, perseverance, and emotional control. And they found that in the US, only 40% of school-age children assess as flourishing. And this extends to adults as well, with only 1/3 of adults reporting that they don't participate in any kind of informal learning activities, meaning going to museums or the library or parks or anything that's going to help them to receive those benefits of outside learning, and also not supporting that generational transmission of knowledge as well. And there are many external barriers that are largely rooted in inequitable social structures that make it harder for kids and adults to feed their curiosity over their lifetime and thus thrive with resilience. And evidence also suggests that this curiosity gap actually promotes those inequities and reinforces those systemic problems and other societal challenges. Basically, we don't know what we don't know, and we cannot seek out what we don't know to seek out. The flower sculptures were a catalyst for us to encourage us to seek out ways to expand the availability and proximity in our community to informal and playful learning opportunities for underserved kids in our own neighborhood. And so we partnered with our local school and our local community organization who was renovating a park to install 2 playful learning landscapes in high traffic locations already frequented by families in our African-American neighborhoods. We also curated a group of local artists to kind of help design that. And we held we worked with local college students and kids in our community, and actually people from every demographic and age bracket to hold workshops to help design and speak into the values of our community, as well as what the design would look like. And it was a great opportunity for the community to speak into that. And we're excited to have those installed this year. But we realized, our families in poverty are pressed for resources, time, money, and mobility. And so creating beauty and play and learning in spaces where they already are just makes sense and promotes more just and dignified practices. And we think this is even true, especially post-COVID, even more so. What I think is really most important about the Wilkening study that I just mentioned was that they identified curiosity as a factor of both child and adult flourishing. And we know that curiosity and play also informs resilience. We know that play can be, how important play can be for developing and improving adult and positive adult and child relationships, as well as the identity development and cultural identity building, which is important in all of our communities, and the generational transmission of knowledge. And all of that helps us to think about play in a much broader context, instead of just for the child alone, but for the child and everyone and everything that is connected to the child. Right. So in essence, play is good for our communities at large and starts to bump into some of those inequitable systems that prevent us from learning and being curious. But maybe the most important benefit of play is that it's fun. The first value that Neighborhood North identified for itself was to have fun. We believe that play sparks learning, creativity, and innovation and connects learners across communities and generations. And we believe it does all of those things because it's fun. And we believe play and fun are issues of justice. We're all aware of the many studies that show how fun improves learning and cognition, and that when kids are doing fun hands-on activities, especially with people they trust and care about, that they're taking in information through multiple senses, and that congruence creates rich memories or sticky learning. Fun should be even more elevated in places impacted by poverty, community trauma, or systemic racism. And yet often we do the exact opposite for underrepresented learners, asking schools to perform a high stakes test at the expense of recess and arts programming, and having spaces that are impacted by these systemic problems void of these fun learning environments. However, an IMLS funded study found that fun was actually what families valued most highly as a determinant of their experience together, even over education. And so we know, of course, when parents and children have fun together, they talk about the focus topic later on and connect it with other subject matter, extending the learning and enhancing both the relational connection and the educational experience, and not detracting from it. So really, fun should be I would love to see fun being a celebratory language around play, and fun, and that we would elevate it to a valued fundamental resource for both learning and better health outcomes for our children and families. And my hope is that all families, regardless of their zip code in the United States and regardless of their place on this earth, would have the opportunities to share fun experiences and conversations with their children about art, beauty, culture, and science, because they are integrated into the built environment. It seems possible. So thank you. And we're now going to turn it over to the full panel for a Q&A.
Absolutely. It seems possible. Thank you for those encouraging words. I'm excited to think about being in a world that has turned our communities into learning landscapes. Very exciting to think about for all of us. If everyone on the panel could please join me, I'd really love to start the conversation with all of you and think together about some of these issues. Christine, I was really touched when you said that the children said they didn't think the space was for them. They didn't think it was for them. And then we heard earlier about the importance of our community spaces feeling inclusive and safe and sustainable for children. And we've had these examples from rural America, and we have Play Africa with us. This is a global movement, and it's so important. Sarah, what would you add to this? How big is this movement across the world and in the United States?
Sure. I mean, we do work across the United States and increasingly internationally. You know, I think that the emphasis on play was something, the movement certainly started pre-pandemic, pre-COVID. But my sense is that the pandemic really heightened the importance of thinking creatively about how we can support children's development and children's education. You know, I think for as many children as didn't have access to high quality formal learning opportunities pre-pandemic, that was certainly exacerbated by the pandemic, and we saw the educational gaps in our system, you know, really highlighted. So even more children just didn't have access, you know, because childcares were closing, kids were not going to school, schools were shut down. And so the gaps that existed before the pandemic even became that much more highlighted. So my sense is that people are really getting on board with this. I will say that we get calls from new cities and new organizations every week wanting to do something, wanting information about this. And sometimes there's one person who has heard of this work and says, how can I get it started? Sometimes it's a group of people who say, we're halfway through the process already, help us out. But it really, I think, is quite the global movement, which is very exciting, because I believe very strongly in its power to not only transform communities, but really change the game for kids and families.
Absolutely. And I love that you've really tied the science of early learning to these playful landscapes. Zviko, I really am so excited by what you're telling us about the co-design with children and how you help children ideate and make these prototypes. We're on a series focusing on innovation. I think co-designing with children is an amazing innovation that can be used in many, many contexts. Have you had any pushback to the issue of co-design with children, or any concerns? And if so, how have you addressed them? And if you haven't had any concern, I'd be delighted to hear that you haven't.
Sorry, I'm just realizing my mic was already on.
Okay.
So it's really been exciting, if anything, to co-design with children. I think a lot of what we tend to face is people being concerned about using the approach, because children tend to be very, very explorative in terms of their thinking. They don't have any limitations in terms of what they might propose. So I think that's some of the concerns that we have been receiving from adults, where they are worried about how they're going to use this approach to design with children to actually implement things in their communities, if some of the suggestions that will possibly come out of those workshops are very large scale and maybe not realistic enough and all that. But I think what's been exciting for me is actually just getting to understand how children are perceiving space and what their needs are. And I think sometimes that's as much as we need to understand from them. It's less about what the specific design is, but what need they are trying to express when they are requesting a roller coaster, for example. That maybe it's not really that you need to implement a roller coaster, but it's that they are looking for some excitement in the space, So I think that's been really interesting and fascinating to see the various ways in which children express their needs, or even just express the challenges that they are facing. And yeah, it's been a fun journey.
Yeah, and the wisdom and excitement that early educators like you bring to helping to interpret and validate the voices of children. That's so amazing and innovative. You see the same thing too, Christine, and you're even in a small community, you're seeing the exact same thing.
We are. I'm nodding because I think it's brilliant, and I think it's really exciting to have the kids speak into it. But we have a lot of kids who really want to see unicorns, and I agree, and exactly like you're saying. Some adults don't like it, but I think, like, what are kids saying that's missing? And it's just I think more fun, right, or more imagination, and but I think it's great to let kids express themselves and have voice in this. And when they see it come up and they see something exist that they were able to speak into, I think that's really important, actually. So yeah, I'm excited about the work you're doing.
And I know, Christine, you had an experience with some co-design with children at your space. Was it a school official who was there and was just amazed at the ideas that the kids were generating?
Yeah, because some of them were really actually very brilliant too, right? So we had all the entire scale of everything. Yeah. So yeah, they were amazed by kids being able to speak into things in really coherent ways as well.
So what happens when all of these public spaces aren't designed with children in mind? I think oftentimes what we observe is people trying to create discipline and boundaries for kids in spaces because they're doing something bad or they shouldn't be doing it or they need to sit still. And so when the places are designed without children in mind, it becomes an opportunity to really have maybe not the most positive interactions with children, right? So having fun with children. Can fun be in the United States? We're not going to talk about Play Africa right now. I don't know, but can fun be valued in the United States in the same sentence with learning? I wonder, Sarah. Tell me about that.
I mean, I obviously think it should. I think that the science tells us that it absolutely should. We know that those are the conditions under which kids learn. And frankly, adults need this too. I mean, as much as we are focused on children today, I think, play as a resilience builder and as a way to, address some mental health concerns, particularly post-pandemic. I mean, this is the way that kids and adults need to be playing. And so as much as we're talking about creating spaces for kids, we oftentimes think about creating intergenerational spaces that give opportunity and invitation to adults and caregivers and elders in the community to play too, because that's important. You might play a little bit differently. It might look a little bit different, but everybody needs to have that playful experience.
Christine, I'm so impressed and awestruck by how deeply you have taken the equity conversation around play and how the intentionality that you've brought to play equity, talking about opportunity to play as a social justice issue. I wonder if you want to elaborate more on that and how that shows up in your community.
Yeah, well, I think it is a justice issue. I think that we treat I think when you have resources to go do things that are playful and fun, you're able to leave your community and to go do those things. And when you don't have resources, you're often in a school that has to remove those extra things from the school environment, but also then from your built environment as well. And so then playfulness is not, it shouldn't be optional for a child, nor should it be optional for an adult, right? And so that's that systemic cycle that we're talking about, is then the parents aren't modeling that for the kids because maybe they're not home, or there's trauma in the community, right? As a community, there's community trauma and there's systemic trauma from racism. And you have all of these things that are being layered onto a young child. And we know that play is a social justice issue, because play is healthy and good. And so not having those things in your space, your community, not having parks and playgrounds, or museums, or sometimes not even libraries, right? So these things are justice issues, just like healthy food or quality schools. So I do believe that it is.
What do you say to people who say, well, there's such a huge achievement gap with these communities and other communities that what we really need is more time on task, more time
I would
doing
say
homework?
that the research shows that, like, we learn better when we're having fun and are engaged in activities. And I think during the learning pods, it was a gift to us to be able to do that, because we brought in teaching artists to teach our students, and they learned better that way. They were on task, but learning through the arts and learning through activities that were engaging their minds, spirits, and bodies in ways that were how kids learn. So I would say that there's a lot of research and study that goes into saying kids learn better in one way than another. So, and I don't think our test scores are showing that kids are learning the way they're that the schools are having to do it in Title I schools right now. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I mean, this is a whole other can of worms, but I think you touched on it there at the end, Christine, is what are we using as our measure of achievement, right? I think that if you really follow what we think of as the 6 Cs framework, as the skills that are going to prepare children for life and beyond, really only one of them, C, that content piece is really the only piece we effectively measure in schools. There's not a time when we think about, did you get an A in collaboration today? But maybe we should be thinking about that, right? And I think that if we're really going to think about the skills that are going to prepare children, allow them to flourish, and give them the skills that are going to let them learn to learn, it might not be exactly what traditional schools look like.
I want to remind everybody that immediately following this conversation, in just about 15 minutes, we're going to have you click on a link if you'd like to interact with our speakers. As you know, Zoom webinar and Zoom to be able to talk with them is very different. So you'll have a link that's in the chat. If you want to interact with the speakers, please click that link at 5 o'clock and you'll be able to meet them. I also want to remind you that you will get a follow-up email, which will have the websites. You can go to their websites and see examples of how they've created play spaces in communities, what it looked like, and learn more about it and see what they're actually doing. So we encourage you to do that as well. One of the things that I've noticed is, in suburbia and where a lot of children are living and in other communities as well, you just can't even go for a walk. There's not there's not sidewalks or pedestrian friendly spaces for children to do that. Is that something that, Sarah, we're seeing around the world more and more?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, it's playful learning opportunities and the spaces that you choose are going to be different in every community, regardless of whether it's rural or urban or suburbia. But I think that the two examples that we have here today between Neighborhood North and Play Africa, Neighborhood North is relatively rural. Play Africa is obviously, a larger city. And they work in their surrounds. We've done work in all kinds of communities. And I think, certainly the spaces that you choose might look different. Not every city has a public transportation system. So bus stops are completely irrelevant for those communities. But you're still going to find those places and spaces where families and communities gather. It might be the grocery store. It might be, the community center where people gather in the afternoon or spend their time after school before pickup. So you can still find those hubs of activity in the places that are really ripe for these playful learning moments.
I know a lot of you are putting questions in the chat. I'm going to invite you in the next few minutes to click the link and you can ask these questions to our presenters themselves. So as we come to a close of this part of our program, there are a number of things that we've heard. And so I really want just to remind you what we're talking about is we're really, as somebody wrote in the chat, we're talking about taking play to a new level. We're talking about taking play in communities, working with children, working with families, at the bus stops, at the corner, in the grocery store, making it fun and active. And also, I think very importantly, making it socially engaging. This is what we're trying to create as we innovate with our children. And as you prepare yourself to interact with our panelists, I want to remind you of some of the topics that are coming up soon. Next month, we're going to be talking about how do we actually activate anti-bias approaches. A lot of people are talking about anti-bias education, and we've all heard of the work with Louise Derman Sparks and her colleagues, but how do you make that happen at home right where you are? We're going to be talking about that next month. And then we're going to be talking about innovations in inspiring joy with children and how we honor family voices. So stay tuned the first Thursday of every month and join these conversations where we are bringing up issues that are timely, relevant, and immediately actionable, and providing you with follow-up resources so that you can dig a little bit deeper. So on behalf of our whole CAYL team, I want to thank you for joining us today, and I'm encouraging you, make space for play in your own community right where you are. Hope I see you in the follow-up conversation that we're about to have right now. Good evening, everyone.